That puddle of yours is a safety hazard and an eyesore. And as of this morning, it is functionally part of our recreational easement. So the water comes down whether you sign off or not. That was Brenda Castle, president of the Pinecrest Shores Homeowners Association for 9 years running, standing at the foot of my driveway in white kitten heels sinking into the gravel, telling me she had decided to drain a lake my grandfather dug by hand. The lake sat on my land. The earthen dam that held it sat on my land too, a quarter-mile upstream of her precious subdivision. And she had never once read the page that said so. What she did not know, what she never bothered to verify in the 3 years she spent circling my fence line with a clipboard, was that the dam upstream was mine on a deed recorded in 1947, and every drop of water in that basin existed only because a structure I owned chose to hold it there. She wanted a beach. She was about to learn who controlled the faucet. If a woman in pearls told you she was going to empty a lake your family built across 4 generations, and she had the heavy equipment to start that afternoon, what would you have done? My name is Walt Hendricks. I am 61 years old, and for 34 years, I was a civil engineer specializing in small dams and impoundments for the State Water Resources Division. The man counties called when a farm pond needed a spillway sized or an old earthen berm needed a stability check before the spring melt. I have stood at the toe of failing dams with seepage running clear and then cloudy and known to the hour how long the thing had left. I have signed the orders that drew reservoirs down ahead of a storm and signed the ones that let them fill. The work taught me 2 habits that never left me. The first was to read the document before I formed the opinion. The second was to write down what I saw the day I saw it, because memory argues and paper does not. I retired 6 years ago to the place I had loved my whole life, 80 acres of pine and meadow on the north shoulder of a valley in the mountains, where my grandfather Amos came in 1946 with a mule and a borrowed scraper, and spent 2 summers building a dam across Mill Creek to make a lake for his children to swim in. He was a wheat farmer who had read one engineering pamphlet from the county extension office and decided that was enough. It nearly was not. The first berm he pushed up washed out in the second spring, and he stood in the gap with the water gone and the mud stinking, and, the way my father told it, he did not curse and he did not quit. He drove to the state office, hat in hand, and he asked a young engineer to teach him how to do it right. That engineer drew him a section with a clay core keyed into bedrock and a proper spillway, and he helped Amos file for the construction permit. And that, more than the mule or the scraper, is why the lake is still there. My grandfather learned the same lesson I would spend a career learning. The man who asks for the document and keeps it is the man who keeps the water. That lake has a name on the county plat. It is called Hendricks Pond, 11 acres of cold, clean water at full pool. And it has been in my family since before Brenda Castle's subdivision was a cow pasture. I learned to swim in it. I taught my daughter to swim in it, and I would teach my granddaughter to fish in it, off the same dock my father rebuilt 3 times across his life. There is a flat gray stone set into the top of the dam where my grandfather scratched the year 1947 with a nail before the concrete cured. And I have run my thumb across those 4 numbers more times than I could count. A man does not fight that hard for a puddle. He fights that hard for the people who are in the water with him and the ones who used to be. I live there with my granddaughter, Maddie, who is 15, and came to stay with me after my daughter and her husband died in a wreck on the interstate 4 winters ago. Maddie has her grandmother's stubborn chin and a habit of writing things down, which turned out to matter more than either of us guessed. She came to me silent that first winter, a girl who had lost both parents in a single night. And she did not start talking again, really talking, until the spring I handed her a tackle box, and we sat on the dock for 3 hours, not catching anything. She keeps a notebook now, a green spiral one, and she writes the date at the top of every page, out of a habit she picked up watching me. The first time she filmed something for the folder, she asked me which drive to save it to. And I told her both, always both. And she rolled her eyes at me and saved it to both. That is the kind of person she is becoming, the kind who keeps the copy. My wife, Carol, passed 2 years before Maddie came to me. And the last full day Carol was strong enough to walk the shoreline, she made me promise the water would still be there when Maddie was grown. We did not know yet that Maddie would come to live with us. Carol only meant the family, the someday children, the line going forward. She stood at the edge of the dock with her hand on my arm, lighter than she had ever been, and she looked out at the gold light on the water, and she said, "Do not let anyone talk you out of this place, Walt. You are too polite for your own good." I told her I would not. I keep my promises. I also keep records, because 34 years of state engineering teaches you that the man with the dated file wins the argument every single time, and the man who shouts loses it. When I retired, I did what I had done my whole career. I started a folder, a plain manila folder, labeled in pencil, sitting in the top drawer of the desk by the window that looks down the valley toward Pinecrest shores. Into that folder went the recorded deed, the original 1947 dam construction permit from the state, the water right my grandfather perfected in 1948 for 11 acre-feet of storage, the annual inspection logs I had kept on my own structure out of habit, and photographs of the spillway dated on the back. I did not start it because I expected a war. I started it because that is simply what you do with a thing you intend to keep. Brenda Castle and her husband, Dale, bought the largest lot in Pinecrest Shores 8 years ago, the one closest to where Mill Creek runs out of my property and down into the subdivision's man-made retention basin. Dale Castle ran a development company. I learned later that Dale had been quietly assembling a plan to convert the lower end of the subdivision into a lakefront resort community, with a swimming beach and dock rentals as the centerpiece, and that the whole pitch to his investors depended on having a body of water down low where the beach could go. The trouble was that all the water in that valley was already spoken for. It sat in my lake, behind my dam, on my deed. So Brenda put on the blazer, won the HOA presidency, and went looking for a way to move my water downhill into her husband's brochure. The first contact was almost polite. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in May, Brenda drove her white SUV up my access road, the one with the vanity plate that read Hope Praise, and got out in a magenta blazer over yoga pants with a clipboard pressed to her chest. I was changing the oil in the tractor when I heard the gravel, and I stood up wiping my hands on a rag and watched her pick her way across the yard in white kitten heels, choosing each step like the ground had personally offended her. She told me the association had concerns about my pond. She used the word amenity. She said the community felt the water would be better enjoyed as a shared recreational resource lower in the valley, and that the dam I maintained was, in her words, an outdated liability the HOA would prefer to see decommissioned. I asked her if she had read the plat. She blinked at me. I told her my land was not part of Pinecrest Shores, never had been, that it was excluded by name on the recorded subdivision map she could pull at the county office for $2. I told her the dam was a permitted structure I inspected myself, that the water was deeded to my family, and that none of it fell within her association's boundaries. She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided you are wrong. The patient smile of a woman who has never once been the one who was mistaken. And she said the board would be the judge of what fell within its jurisdiction. She wrote something on her clipboard. She told me she would be in touch. Then she picked her way back across the yard to the SUV, and she left. And I stood there with the rag in my hand, and a cold feeling I had learned to trust on job sites. The feeling you get when a structure looks fine and the numbers say it is not. That was incident 1. I went inside and filed the date. A week later, the first letter came. It was an HOA notice of violation, citing my property for an unpermitted water feature creating downstream hazard, assessing a fine of $200 and demanding I submit a decommissioning plan within 30 days. I do not belong to Pinecrest Shores. My land has never been part of the association, a fact recorded in plain ink on the subdivision plat, which excludes my 80 acres by meets and bounds. The HOA had no more authority to fine me than the man at the hardware store. I wrote a short letter saying so, sent it certified, kept the green card, then put the whole exchange in the folder. Incident 2. $200 in fines I would never pay, the first of many. The letters did not stop. They came monthly, then weekly, each one citing a new invented violation, each one adding to a running total Brenda seemed to believe was real. One cited me for an unapproved exterior color because the spillway concrete had weathered gray. One cited me for unauthorized livestock because a neighbor's cattle had drifted across the creek. One cited me for failure to maintain community aesthetic standards, as if my grandfather's lake were a lawn she could measure. By the end of that first summer, the imaginary balance had climbed past $4,000, and every notice went into the folder behind a tab I labeled simply fines, unpaid, uncollectible. I started photographing each envelope the day it arrived, the postmark visible before I even opened it. I want to be honest about something. There were nights I sat at the desk by the window with the valley going dark below me and wanted to drive down to a board meeting and put my career on the table and dare her to read a single line of the water code out loud. I never did. A man who keeps his temper keeps his options, and the file was filling up on its own, one foolish letter at a time, each one a sentence she would not be able to take back. The first time Brenda crossed from nuisance into something colder was the following spring, when she sent an inspector. He arrived on a Thursday morning in a polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his pocket and a clipboard of his own. And he announced he was there to perform a compliance walkthrough of my dam on behalf of the association. He had a soft handshake and an official voice, the kind a man practices. And he kept glancing back at the white SUV idling at the bottom of my road where Brenda sat watching. He was not a state inspector. He was not a county official. He was a man Dale Castle had hired, with a badge ordered off the internet, sent to walk onto my permitted structure and take measurements he had no right to take. I met him at the gate. I did not raise my voice. I asked for his credentials, and he handed me the laminated card with the confidence of a man who had never been asked before. I read it slowly. It had a seal on it that did not match any agency in the state, and a title, Regional Compliance Officer, that does not exist in any code I spent 34 years inside. I turned it over. The back was blank. I handed it back to him, and I told him, level as I could, that impersonating a regulatory inspector to gain access to a permitted dam was a thing the state took a hard look at, and that I would be documenting his visit, the date, his face, and the plate on his truck. The official voice went out of him all at once. He said he was just doing what he was asked. I told him that was what they all said, and that he should go ask whoever asked him whether they wanted their name on a report to the state engineer. He left faster than he came. Maddie filmed the whole thing from the porch on her phone, steady as a rail, and that night she saved it to 2 drives the way I had taught her, and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page in the green notebook. Incident 9, if you were counting, and I was. That afternoon, I drove to the county sheriff's office and sat down with a deputy named Russ Tilford, a calm, heavy-set man about my age who had grown up 2 valleys over. I laid the folder on his desk and walked him through it in order. The fines, the fake inspector, the newsletter, the letters. Russ turned the pages slowly, and he did not interrupt. And when he got to the photograph of the laminated badge, he stopped and tapped it with one finger and said, "That is a problem for him, not for you." Then he told me the thing that constrained officers always have to tell you. He said that as long as Brenda kept her people off my land and stuck to paper, there was not much he could act on. Because a complaint had to be acted on regardless of how foolish it was. And a pattern had to be built before anyone could move. He said the law made him roll on a complaint even when he could see it was nonsense, and that the same law would protect me the day the nonsense became a crime. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Document every contact, date everything. Save the footage to 2 places. He said if she ever crossed onto the land physically, or touched the structure, or put a person in danger, to call him directly, day or night, before I did anything else. He said a lot of these standoffs went bad because the owner finally lost his temper and gave the other side something to point at, and that the surest way to win was to be the only calm man at the gate when he pulled up. Then he wrote his cell number on the back of a card and slid it across the desk, and I put the card in the folder behind the tab marked Sheriff. "Build the pattern," he said. "You are most of the way there. You just need her to do the one thing she cannot help doing. I want to tell you what that dam actually is, because it matters for everything that came after. It is not a wall of concrete. It is an earthen embankment, 240 feet long and 22 feet high at the deepest point. With a clay core my grandfather keyed into the bedrock, and a rip-rap face he hauled stone by stone. The water leaves through a principal spillway, a concrete weir with a gate valve I can open and close by hand, and an emergency spillway cut into the rock at the far abutment for the 100-year flood. I had operated that gate twice a year my whole retirement, drawing the pool down a few feet each autumn to inspect the upstream face, raising it again each spring, the same rhythm my father kept and his father before him. The point is this: the lake Brenda wanted to drain into her husband's beach was not a natural body of water that happened to sit on my land. It was a thing my dam made. Open my gate all the way, and Mill Creek runs free, and that 11 acres becomes a mud flat and a trickle inside a week. Close it, and the valley fills. There was no version of their plan that did not run through my hand on that valve. Whoever controlled the dam controlled the water. And the dam, on a deed recorded in 1947, was mine. The escalation widened that summer the way these things do. Brenda stopped writing only to me and started writing about me. She sent a newsletter to all 400 households in Pinecrest Shores describing the dangerous, unmaintained dam above the community and the stubborn upstream landowner refusing to cooperate with safety improvements. She put a photograph of my dam in it, taken with a long lens from the road, with the gray weathered spillway made to look like neglect. She organized a petition and got most of a page of signatures from people who had never walked within a half-mile of my property. She stood up at a county planning meeting in front of the commissioners and called my grandfather's lake a liability pond and asked them to declare it a public nuisance. And she said, into the microphone, that some people in this valley think a piece of paper from before any of us were born gives them the right to hold a whole community hostage. I sat in the back of that meeting in my good shirt and said nothing, because the engineer in me knew that a public record of her claims was worth more to me than any rebuttal. And a clerk was typing every word she said into the minutes, including that one about the piece of paper. I requested a certified copy of those minutes the next morning under the open records law. $2 a page, into the folder. Incident 14. Then Dale's name surfaced in a way that explained all of it. A man named Carl Pruitt, who sat on the HOA board and ran the feed store down in the valley, drove up to my place one evening looking like he had not slept. I knew Carl a little, the way you know a man whose store you have bought fence staples from for years. And I had never seen him look the way he looked on my porch that night, holding his cap in both hands and turning it. He told me he had voted for Brenda twice, and he was sick about it. He said he had stayed quiet through the letters because he told himself it was just paperwork, just Brenda being Brenda. Then he had sat in a board meeting where Dale showed slides. He had seen the resort prospectus. Dale Castle had been showing investors a rendering of a swimming beach and a marina at the low end of the subdivision. White sand trucked in, a row of rental docks, and the rendering showed open water where the retention basin currently sat dry half the year. Carl said a man from out of state had asked Dale, right there in the meeting, where the water for all that was going to come from. And Dale had pointed at a spot upstream on the map and said, "That is being handled. The upstream parcel is being brought into compliance." The upstream parcel? That was me. Carl said he had gone home and could not eat. The only way to fill that basin year-round was to release the water held behind my dam and let it run downhill into Dale's development. The HOA campaign against my pond was not about safety. It was about moving 11 acres of my family's water into Dale Castle's brochure, where it would become beachfront lots at premium prices. Carl pulled a folded copy of the prospectus out of his jacket and held it out to me, and his hand was not quite steady. I thanked him. I told him he had done a hard thing and a right one. He said he just wanted it on the record that one person on that board had not gone along. I filed it that night, and I understood for the first time exactly what I was holding. Because here is what Brenda and Dale had never checked. To fill their beach, they needed my water. To get my water, they needed my dam to release it. And my dam was not theirs to operate, not theirs to decommission, not theirs to touch. The water right itself, perfected by my grandfather in 1948 and never abandoned, said the 11-acre feet were stored for use on my land and my land only. Any release of that water was mine to decide. Dale could draw all the renderings he liked. The faucet was in my hand, and it had been in my family's hand since before his subdivision existed. They had built an entire investment scheme on the assumption that the water upstream was a public nuisance they could make disappear, when in fact it was a private asset I controlled by deed, by permit, and by a water right older than the road they drove in on. The winter passed quiet, and I let myself believe Carl's visit had been the high water mark. It was not. The following March, on a cold, bright Wednesday, I heard the sound that no engineer who has built his life around a structure ever wants to hear. Heavy diesel engines coming up my access road, more than one. Maddie was home from school with a cold, on the couch under a blanket, and she sat up at the sound the same as I did. I told her to stay on the porch and keep her phone up. I walked out to the gate and saw an excavator on a lowboy trailer, a 40,000-pound machine with a braking hammer on the arm, a pickup with the logo of Dale's company on the door, and behind them, Brenda's white SUV with the Hopres plate. A foreman got out with a printed work order in a plastic sleeve and told me they were there to breach the dam, that he had an authorization from the property owner of record. I told him I was the property owner of record. He looked at his paper. The paper said something different. Brenda came up beside him in her magenta blazer and pearls, sunglasses pushed up on her head, picking through the same gravel in the same wrong shoes. And she said the words I will never forget. She said, "The board voted, the easement is ours, and that wall comes down today whether you like it or not. This water belongs to the community now." She said it loud. For the foreman, for the men in the truck, the way a person talks when she is performing certainty she does not actually have. I told them to stop. I kept my voice level because Russ had told me to, and because Carol had told me to years before that. I told the foreman that the structure was a permitted dam, that breaching it without a state permit was a felony under the water code, that the water was deeded to my family, and that if that excavator crossed my gate, I would have every one of them arrested and their licenses pulled. The foreman looked at his work order, and then he looked at the actual dam. 240 feet of engineered embankment with a concrete spillway and a stone face. And I watched him do the math that Dale had never done. He said this was not what he had been told. He said he had been told it was an illegal berm a homeowner had pushed up without a permit, a weekend job, an afternoon's work to knock down. I handed him a copy of the 1947 construction permit through the bars of the gate, the state seal plain on it, and I told him to call his own lawyer before he laid a hammer on a state-permitted dam. Because the man who operates the machine is the man the state charges. The foreman, to his credit, read it and shut his machine down and took his hard hat off. Brenda did not stop, though. She climbed up onto the lowboy trailer in her kitten heels, gripping the excavator's track for balance, and she started screaming at the foreman to do his job. That she would have his company blacklisted from every project in the county, that she did not care about his paperwork. And that was when Maddie, who had come down off the porch and was standing beside me at the gate with her cold and her blanket still around her shoulders, lifted her phone and held it steady and got every word of it. I had already called Russ Tilford the moment I heard the engines. He arrived 11 minutes later, and he found a furious HOA president standing on a flatbed trailer ordering a contractor to commit a felony. All of it on my granddaughter's phone and a state dam construction permit in the foreman's hand. Russ took one look and told everyone to step back from the gate. Then he asked Brenda for the permit authorizing the breach. She did not have one. She had a work order Dale's company had typed up, and an HOA board resolution and a great deal of certainty, and not one piece of paper from the state. Russ told the foreman to load the excavator back onto the trailer and leave, and the foreman did, gladly. That was the day the pattern finished building itself. Incident 22, and the first one that was a crime. What Brenda did next told me she still did not understand what she was standing on. She filed suit. She had the HOA's lawyer draft a complaint demanding the court declare my dam a public nuisance and order it removed. And she had me served on my own porch, and she told the Valley newspaper that the community was finally taking the dangerous Upstream landowner to court. I read the complaint twice. It was built entirely on the claim that my dam was an unpermitted hazard sitting on land within the association's recreational easement. Every load-bearing sentence in it was a fact she had never checked. I called a water rights attorney named Frank Mosley, a dry old hand who had argued before the state engineer for 40 years and had once, decades back, sat across a hearing table from me when I was the state's witness. He remembered me. He drove out the next morning, and I handed him the folder on the porch with 2 cups of coffee between us. He read it slow, page by page, licking his thumb to turn them, saying nothing for the better part of an hour. He spent a long time on the prospectus Carl had given me. When he reached the 1947 permit and the 1948 water right, he stopped, and he set the folder down on his knee, and he looked out at the lake for a moment before he looked at me. He said, "Walt, she has sued you for owning the one thing that lets her have any water at all." He said, "Do they understand that the lake only exists because your gate is closed? Do they know what your gate does?" I told him I did not think they had ever once thought about the gate. That in 3 years, not one letter, not one notice, not one word at any meeting had mentioned that the water they wanted was water I made. Frank smiled at that, the first time all morning. He said that was the whole case then. He said we would not argue. We would simply put 3 pieces of paper on the table and ask the other side one question they could not answer, and let the silence do the work. He told me to wear my good shirt and to say nothing unless the judge asked me directly. The documents would talk, he said. They always do, when they are older than the lie. The hearing was set for a Monday morning in the county courthouse, the kind of plain wood-paneled room where water disputes in the mountains have been settled for a century. Brenda came in a fresh blazer with Dale beside her in a suit, and their lawyer, and a row of Pinecrest Shores residents she had brought to fill the seats. The HOA's lawyer stood up and made his case. He said the dam was an unpermitted structure. He said it was a hazard to the community below. He said the association's recreational easement extended to the water, and that the upstream landowner had refused all reasonable cooperation. He used the word liability 9 times. When he sat down, Frank Mosley stood up, and Frank did not raise his voice once. Frank laid 3 documents on the clerk's table and asked that they be entered into the record. The first was the deed to my 80 acres, recorded in 1947, describing the dam and the impoundment by meets and bounds as private property, explicitly outside the boundaries of the subdivision that would not exist for another 40 years. The second was the original state permit for the construction of the dam, issued to Amos Hendricks in 1947, making the structure a lawful permitted dam under state jurisdiction, the decommissioning of which required a state permit no one in that courtroom had applied for. The third was the certificate of water right, perfected in 1948, granting my family 11 acre-feet of storage for use on our own land, a right senior to every other claim in the valley by decades. Frank turned to the judge and said the association had not sued to remove a hazard. It had sued to seize a private water right it did not own. Held behind a state-permitted dam it had tried to breach without authority, and the only public interest in the room was the felony attempt to destroy that dam 3 weeks earlier, which was already under review by the sheriff. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Eleanor Voss, who had clearly read every page before anyone spoke, looked over her glasses at the HOA's lawyer and asked a single question. She asked whether the association had verified, before filing suit and before sending equipment to breach the structure, whether the dam was permitted and whether the water was privately decreed. The lawyer looked at Brenda. Brenda looked at Dale. Nobody answered, because the answer was no. And everyone in the room understood in that silence that no one on the other side had ever read a single one of the 3 documents now lying on the clerk's table. Eleanor Voss let the silence hold for a long moment. Then she set her pen down. She dismissed the nuisance claim with prejudice. She ruled the dam a lawful permitted structure and the water a senior private right. And she noted for the record that any attempt to alter or breach the dam without a state permit would be a criminal matter, not a civil one. She ordered the association to pay my legal costs. And then, because Frank had quietly entered Maddie's video and the work order into evidence, she referred the attempted breach to the district attorney. Across the aisle, I watched Brenda Castle realize, for the first time in 3 years, that the puddle she had been trying to drain was the only thing holding her husband's entire resort together, and that she had just handed a courtroom the proof that they had tried to destroy it illegally. She did not say a word. For once, the woman who always had a clipboard had nothing to write. The consequence fell exactly where her overreach had aimed. The district attorney charged Dale Castle and named the HOA in a filing over the attempted criminal mischief and unlawful interference with a state-permitted dam, built almost entirely on Maddie's video and the foreman's work order. The foreman, it turned out, was glad to tell investigators exactly who had told him the dam was an illegal berm, and exactly who had stood on his trailer screaming when he refused. The investors who had been promised a lakefront resort read about the felony referral in the same Valley newspaper Brenda had used to attack me on the front page, above the fold. And they were gone inside a month. Because no one funds a beachfront development whose entire water supply is a senior private right held by the man the developers tried to sue and then tried to bulldoze. Without investors, the resort collapsed. The renderings of white sand and rental docks went back in a drawer. The lower subdivision, the one that had been counting on my water to fill its basin, stayed a dry retention pond half the year, exactly as it had always been, because the only water that could ever have filled it was 11 acres I would never release. Brenda lost the HOA presidency in the next election, voted out by the same 400 households she had told I was the danger, several of whom drove up my road afterward to apologize, hats in hand, the way Carl had. Dale's company filed for bankruptcy protection before the year was out. They had tried to take my water, and in the trying, they had destroyed the only thing that could have justified taking it. I want to give you the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story. In 3 years, Brenda Castle assessed me $11,400 in fines. I paid $0. Not $1, because not one of those notices was lawful. The deed that ended it was recorded 79 years before she ever drove up my road. The water right was perfected 78 years before she decided it was hers. My dam held 11 acres of water through the whole fight and holds it still. And the entire scheme, the resort, the investors, the beach, every brochure Dale ever printed, came to exactly nothing, because they built it all on water that was never theirs and a dam they never owned. That spring, after the dismissal, I drew the pool down a few feet the way I do every year. And I walked the upstream face of the dam with Maddie beside me, checking the rip-rap, just as my grandfather had walked it, and just as I had walked it my whole life. Maddie asked me if I had ever been scared we would lose it. I told her the truth. I told her I was never scared of losing the lake, because the lake was never really what was at stake. What was at stake was whether a person who keeps her records and walks her boundaries can be rolled over by a person who keeps neither. We raised the gate that evening and watched the valley fill back to full pool. 11 acres of cold, clean water going gold in the last light. And Maddie skipped a flat stone across it, the way her great-great-grandfather must have hoped someone always would. The water was still there. I had promised Carol it would be. So here is what I want you to take from this, plainly, because it is the only part that matters for your own land. Pull your deed and read it, the whole legal description, and walk your property line with it in your hand until you can point to every corner. If there is a structure on your land, a dam, a well, a barn, a fence, find the permit that made it lawful and keep a copy where you can reach it in 5 minutes. Learn what a water right is and whether you hold one. Because in the dry country, the water is worth more than the dirt. When someone with a clipboard and a blazer tells you that your property is functionally part of their jurisdiction, do not argue with them on your driveway. Smile, write down the date, and start a folder. The person with the older, cleaner, recorded document wins every time. And the only thing standing between you and that win is whether you did the boring work of keeping the paper before you ever needed it. Authority that will not show you its permit is not authority. It is a costume. If you have got a story like this, a clipboard that tried to take what was yours, put it in the comments. Because I read them, and so do the people who need to hear they are not crazy. Subscribe if you want the next one, where a retired land surveyor gets a certified letter telling him the gravel road his family graded for 60 years now belongs to the HOA that paved one end of it. And he pulls out an easement map drawn in 1939 that says otherwise. Keep your papers. Walk your lines. I will see you on the next one.